Next, I would like to introduce Jesse Reed. Jesse Reed is the managing partner of Order, a Brooklyn-based design office specializing in brand identity systems for a wide range of clients, some of which include Apple, Williams College, MoMA, SpaceX, and Rex Frazier. In addition to Order, Jesse Reed is the co-founder of Standards Manual, an independent publishing imprint, and Standards, a digital brand guidelines product. In 2021, he launched Order Type Foundry, an extension of the design office that will release commercial fonts from a new generation of type designers. For those of you who are type geeks in the audience, you understand that that is a BFD, a big fucking deal. And for those of you who are not type geeks, it's a really big deal. Jesse is originally from Youngstown, Ohio, and is a graduate of the University of Cincinnati. So I'm going to add to that. That was Jesse's formal introduction. Matthew, who's on the board, who's my other design and tech half. So Matthew and Jesse, I guess 3 years ago now, you were introduced, you were having casual conversation, and Matthew took a leap and asked in July of 2022, when we were on the precipice of building something much larger than what had existed for many years, since 2008, asked if Jesse Reed of Order Design would be willing to take on the visual identity of Rex Frazier. And this is no small feat, given Jesse's worked on the biggest brands in the world, right? To work on Apple, nobody gets to work on Apple. You have to be the Navy SEAL of design to work on Apple. You don't get invited in for that. I'm still waiting for my invitation. And for Jesse to say yes, and to understand that we were a fledgling organization, and to take a chance on us, September 2022 of last year. And many of you got to see the debut of our visual identity at last year's event at Troutbeck. So we are absolutely honored that you're here today, and Jesse has a special guest that he's also going to introduce when he's at the mic. We thank you very much for being here.
The special guest is my mother, so she's sitting right here. She came, yeah, there we go. All the way from Cincinnati, Ohio, so she made it here just for this. That was way too much of an introduction. I'm not anywhere compared to the Navy SEALs of graphic design, but I'll take it. And that was such a great first talk to set up what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to give you a history lesson. I'm not qualified to give you a history lesson, but yeah, Jerry did such an amazing job on sort of setting up a lot of the themes that we captured when we were developing the identity for Rex Frazier. We also sometimes call it a visual language, and I'll sort of get into that. So yeah, I'm going to talk a lot about fonts and logos and colors. So if that's your thing, you're in for a treat. If it's not, maybe you'll learn something. So this was sort of the question that we started with when we took on the project, and sort of when we take on any project, sort of like, why does anything need an identity? You could be Apple, you could be Rex Frazier, you could be a car company, you could be anything. But there has to be purpose in an identity and what that represents, and what that really communicates. So there's a lot of function that we think about when we think about brand or graphic identity. And so it's not single-tiered, it really does many different things. And so in this case, it was at least 4 or 5 different sort of opportunities that we saw. So, first, and everything in this room is just sort of singing on sort of what this project, sort of like how it came to be, but it's preserving the legacy of the artist, and so the person himself, who he was, his history. Again, that was such a great setup so that I don't have to do it on who he was as a person. Of course, his work that he would ultimately do as an untrained artist. A lot of the social and historical contributions that he would eventually make, And then how that sort of then, transcends to where we are today. And for so many people, probably not this room, but so many people outside of this place, discovering Rex for the very first time. And so really how his work is displayed, how his story is told, that's what we're all here today to celebrate and to make sure actually happens. And so, this has started to happen a lot more in a lot of different places. And maybe most importantly, the sort of the archival nature of the work that Matthew has been doing, scanning all of Rex's work and putting it, on places online and in digital archives so that this can sort of go on many, many years into the future. And so, there's a lot of different ways in which his story can be told. Of course, you can do that through words, but this project and sort of what we were centered around doing was really developing a visual language so we could support all the stories that, you all and that we all tell about Rex and make sure none of that gets forgotten. And this is really difficult. This is not an easy thing to do, to sort of create an identity for an artist. How do you start doing that? He being a visual person, you could say that his identity is his work, just in and of itself. And so why create something on top of that? And so what we want to try to avoid is doing any sort of mimicking of the artwork. That's not what we're trying to do. So doing something that looks like this probably won't be awesome. So we put a big red X through it. So we don't want to pretend like we're making a stylized version of the work that Rex made. And so instead, what we're really trying to do is capture the essence of who Rex Brazier was and what his work really represented. And again, I won't repeat all the things that Jerry mentioned, but so much of that story and working from life, not from sort of stuffed birds, really being out in nature, that is the essence of who he was and what is captured in this work. And so, this is just an example of sort of woodcut prints from Germany, from between World War I and World War II. I did work, one of my previous jobs was working at MoMA. I'm sure all of you know it, have been there. And so we used to create these identities for different exhibitions within the museum. So this is one that was called German Expressionism, the Graphic Impulse. And really what we wanted to do was capture just that sort of texture and sort of the act of making prints, but not trying to mimic or sort of put a picture of the work itself. And so typography, letters, fonts, whatever you want to call it, that's one place where this can really do that job. And so perhaps that was something that we could do with Rex Brazier. And so this is really interesting, and we didn't, discover this, but it certainly goes, I think, unrecognized. But Jerry did mention it, that he was an engraver for Tiffany, and so he was almost more of a trained letterer than he was a painter. And if you see at the very bottom of this scan and all the work that's on this table, he didn't just sign his work like sort of a Picasso signature. He lettered his name, and then he also had this monogram of an RB, and then he very carefully sort of lettered the date in which the print or the painting was done. And so as you look at these prints, look really closely, because you'll just see all these things that we scanned in really high resolution and blew up. On the prints, his signatures, but then also the covers of the books that he did. He hand did all of that lettering, so you can sort of see all these different examples. And so what we were really interested in was just discovering a little bit deeper, was there something within this lettering style? I actually love his signature. I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small, but he drew like a portrait of himself inside of an R, smoking a pipe. That could have been the logo pretty easily, but sort of spoiler, it's not, but it's very, it has sort of so much character and personality. And so that's what we wanted to capture, is like, how do we take the character and personality of Rex through his lettering, not mimic the artwork, but put that into the identity. So, this is sort of boring presentation stuff that we do, but it's very helpful to sort of level set on the same page when we're working with a client like this, to make sure that we're doing what we're expected to do and that we will achieve that goal. So the first one is to develop sort of a mark or a symbol that represents the essence of Brazier without mimicking or impersonating. The second was to really support the identity with a really simple but highly functional visual system. So you'll see what I mean by that. So there are things beyond just the logo that need to work so that you get invitations and posters and postcards and everything sort of looks like it comes from the same place. And then we sort of created a very core set of applications so that the association and this group could really get off the ground and get running with sort of doing the work that they need to do. So, I'm sort of like repeating myself, but just to sort of double down on this idea that this was unlike most projects that we work on, where it was rich in visual material. So this wasn't a bank, or it wasn't, a healthcare company, it wasn't tech, that had nothing visual to really go on. So we had so much material, again, all of which is, most of which is on this table here, that we really dug deeper into. And so I already mentioned that, there was all of this sort of typography and lettering that we could look at. And so then we sort of divided it into different categories of what that was. So the first being that RB monogram. What's interesting is that he didn't do it the same every time. And so I don't know actually how many different versions of there are, but you could see just in sort of these few examples that they're not the same. He wasn't just repeating himself. He was finding a new way of representing that monogram every time he did a piece. Of course, he had his signature, so that's sort of fairly straightforward. His name, which is, again, not a signature, but sort of like written out in Roman characters, just as you would just maybe writing your name in very clearly sort of legible letters on any sort of documents. And then, like I mentioned, he had this lettering, which may have been sort of an outcome of his training at Tiffany. This sort of style of lettering was fairly common at the time, so surely he was influenced by that. But he started to make these very personal decisions on the ways in which certain letter forms were drawn. So where that came from, it could be many different places, but no matter what, we could tell that this was a place that really captured the essence of who Rex was through his sort of verbal, visual language. So this is the place that we really started, and it's amazing that this is here because so this is sort of a stamp from his stationery that he did sort of repeat and was the same on every single one, and then he even took the time to color in sort of the little red on the top of the kingbird on the very top. So we looked at this really closely, and what we did is we just scanned every single letter at extremely high resolution and then just blew it up. So this is like a centimeter tall, and we just blew it up to really see the detail. But of course, because ink and paper, as the artists in this room know, it gets captured differently every time you do that act. And so we looked at all of these different specimens. Even though it was the same letter, it sort of replicates differently every time you set ink on paper. And so we looked at the stationery, we looked at the different ways in which he sort of lettered the covers and the titles of the books that he wrote, and we just started to see what is sort of like the average version of all of these different letters that he did. And of course, what we're just trying to do is create essentially a word mark, so his name and how that's represented. So we just looked at the letters that are in Rex Brazier. What we did is we drew by hand every single letter multiple times and sort of found the one that felt sort of the best, average of all the sum of those parts. And so this is just done with Sharpie and whiteout. We sort of see the comparison that it came from. So it looks similar. It's not exactly right because that one's all sort of, wobbly and not necessarily, quote unquote perfect. And then we take that into a computer and digitize it. So we did this again, and I won't go through every single letter, even though I did in the presentation, of all the letters in Rex's name. So we had a scanned specimen, we hand drew it on top of that, and then we digitized each and one of those letters. So of course the A being one of the most beautiful letters that he drew was sort of, not just a horizontal crossbar on the A. Same with the S. This is sort of a swashy, sort of swooping S that goes below letter forms. The R does the same thing. So you can see we took some liberties. And I'm sorry, this is getting so nerdy in typography, but just bear with me. I'm going to talk about passion. This is what I'm passionate. So you can see, it's much thicker when it is sort of looked at really closely, and so we thinned it out so it wasn't so heavy when it's reproduced. And this is what you get, just sort of right out of the box, every letter that was, So it's beautiful, right? And I think, seeing this, and you all saw it on the invitations. I mean, this logo was on there, but then when you look at the actual work and the covers and all the lettering that he did, I don't know, if you ask me, this really feels like, it literally did come from him. So we did not make this up. We made it a digital version of it, but we're designers, but we didn't design these letters. He designed this logo, essentially. So then you think about, there's different ways to sort of configure it. It could be all in one line. It could be sort of stacked, on top of each other. Those R's, this was sort of the regular R on the top and the bottom, but he had those really beautiful swoopy R's that sort of tuck and nest the A with the S. So we sort of integrated that, and then the very end of the R of his last name to sort of, continue and sort of elongate his name. And then, we started to look at the materials, and he's very imperfect in sort of like the best way, in a sense that nothing is straight, nothing is done with rulers, everything is very organic, because that is, the subject matter of his work. And so we sort of integrated that into the logo. And so instead of having it be a perfect sort of alignment on the left side, we did something where it's asymmetrical, much like his work and sort of the way in which he approached lettering. So this became sort of that final version of the word mark, the logo, whatever you want to call it. There was a color palette that was devised, and at our company, we don't do anything, or we try not to do anything arbitrarily, so we don't impose any of our own ideas. Just like we took this lettering from Brex and just made it, the archived version and the contemporary version of what it is. Same with the colors. So that sort of beige tan color that comes directly from the paper in which the prints are printed on, and then the green is from all of the books that coincidentally also happens to be the same sort of tone, and of course nature, green, leaves, grass, So it all sort of really made sense. So, it wouldn't make any sense to make this red or purple or blue. We sort of really made a very intentional decision to make it a very limited color palette. So, in our work, this is before anything is actually made. And so what I'm going to show you, essentially it's all fake. It's all rendered. We sort of made it up, in a computer sort of model in which you could just imagine what it could look like if you start to make the materials for the organization. So we started to put all of these things together. So color, typography, and then the imagery itself. We didn't need to find imagery, obviously, because it was all, the sort of centerpiece of what this work was. And so you could imagine these being book covers of eventual archives of Rex's work going into the future, business cards, very simply with, those colors sort of coming through on the front. So, an organization like this needs business materials, and so, it is all beautiful and artful, but there are also things like money that needs to get raised, and so you need things in which, to make that happen. And then one last thing is, if you remember before, we sort of mentioned that, that monogram, we sort of couldn't let it go. There was something that we really felt like it needed to have a place in the identity, and so we took, I think it's like 5, I know we definitely scanned more versions of this, but we found at least like 5 different unique versions of the monogram, and just thought, is there something that could be done with this? When we found the 5 different examples, they are interesting, but they felt like a totally separate component from what we were doing with the letters. This one was sort of interesting, but again, pretty disconnected. And so we went back to the word mark and just took that R and the B, we connected them back together, and this created sort of the icon or the symbol for things like social media and sort of the digital, contemporary interfaces that the organization and Rex's work will eventually show up in. So it will be in a physical space and a digital space, and this work needed to sort of span both of those environments. So this is, the core of that identity, that visual language. There's type, there's a logo, there's color, there's imagery, of course, of Rex's work, and then this is all of those materials that we put together for the association to eventually actually create and make real, most of which really did come to life, thanks to Manowars and Matthews, efforts and really putting production behind everything. So postcards, what the website could look like, and remember, this is before any of, the website did exist, but before like the identity was sort of applied to it. So yeah, you can just sort of see what those look like. And then we think about the future and the residencies that might happen sort of on, Rex's sites, what a museum might look like with signage. So really considering every single touch point that a visual language might have to support. Everyone loves tote bags, so why not show this? And a few of those supporting printed materials. So if there eventually is, a residency program, a museum, and sort of a historical sort of, pamphlet on Rex, all of these things can be represented by maybe detailed crops of his work. And so you could think about using, his work not just in the full version of it, but really using it as a graphic device. So I think you get the point. You know, at this sort of stage, we sort of then just made anything we could possibly think of that the identity could be applied to. Pencils, carpenter pencils, because why not? You know, gift shop bags for when that museum eventually exists. And then, you know, when you're riding the NQR train down in the city and there's going to be an exhibition of Rex Brazier, that's what it will look like, right? So, you know, we made billboards. Why not? This is free to do it here, but it's like $50,000 to do it in real life, so why not? There you go. So the poster stand, yeah, there you go. So maybe someone in this room can make this happen. So, you know, no one asked us to do this, but we just thought, you know, it's such a cool idea, why not? So you can see how far you could go. I could like go on for hours just making stuff. I'm not going to do that. So this is the end. So this is essentially what the, you know, it even says the possibilities are endless, which they are. So the core of the identity, sort of what those different components are, so the letters that Rex essentially designed, other supporting typography, color, imagery, and then all those applications that you know, are starting to be made actually today. So then the future, right? So we don't forget about that. So yeah, that's all I have for you. So thank you so much for listening.